A courtroom becomes the stage for a gripping showdown when a young girl stands up for her mother after their case is dismissed. With only a single photo in her hand, Olivia takes on a powerful landlord and a skeptical judge. What will happen when the truth comes to light? Stay tuned to see how this heart-pounding story unfolds, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Olivia Jenkins sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling slightly. Across the room, the landlord, Mr. Larson, sat with a smug expression, his high-priced lawyer whispering confidently in his ear. Angela's 8-year-old daughter, Olivia, sat beside her, clutching a worn notebook. Though Olivia was just a child, her eyes carried a quiet intensity, as if she understood more than anyone gave her credit for. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom with a commanding presence, his gavel slamming down to silence the room. His face was stern, his reputation one of no-nonsense decisions and an unwavering belief in the system. To him, this case was just another petty tenant dispute. He had bigger, more important cases on his docket. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Angela rose to her feet, her voice steady but tinged with desperation. "Your Honor, we were unlawfully evicted. My daughter and I have nowhere to go. The evidence we've submitted shows that Mr. Larson fabricated the notice of non-payment." Mr. Larson's lawyer stood, smirking. "Your Honor, these allegations are baseless. My client acted within the law. The defendant simply failed to pay rent, and this sob story doesn't change the facts." Olivia tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, don't let them scare you. We know the truth." Judge Thompson leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Jenkins, this court cannot operate on emotions. If you have evidence, it needs to be clear and irrefutable." Angela nodded, her hands fumbling as she handed over the copies of notices, emails, and receipts to her public defender. The young attorney, fresh out of law school, approached the bench nervously, laying the documents before Judge Thompson. But the judge barely glanced at them before looking up. "This documentation doesn't prove any wrongdoing. It only shows correspondence. Do you have any solid proof that these notices were falsified?" Angela's voice wavered. "Your Honor, I didn't have time to gather more. My eviction happened so suddenly." "I understand, Ms. Jenkins," Judge Thompson interrupted, his tone curt. "But the law is the law. Without concrete evidence, I cannot rule in your favor." Olivia's hand shot up, catching everyone off guard. Judge Thompson furrowed his brow. "This isn't a classroom, young lady. Sit down." Angela tried to pull her daughter back into her seat, whispering, "Olivia, don't." But Olivia wouldn't be silenced. She stood, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy courtroom atmosphere. "Your Honor, my mom is telling the truth, but no one's listening." Judge Thompson sighed, his patience visibly thinning. "Young lady, this is a court of law, not a place for emotional outbursts." "But what if I have proof?" Olivia said, her voice unwavering. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even Mr. Larson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Angela froze, looking at her daughter in confusion. "Olivia, what are you talking about?" Olivia turned to her mother, her face resolute. "The photo, Mom, the one I took when I was outside the building." Angela's eyes widened as she realized what Olivia was referring to. It was a picture her daughter had taken with her small digital camera the day the landlord's henchman had confronted her. Angela hadn't thought much of it at the time, but Olivia had insisted on keeping it. Judge Thompson rubbed his temples. "This is highly irregular, but if you truly have something, young lady, show it." Olivia stepped forward, clutching her notebook tightly. She handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Inside was a printed photo. It was grainy, but clear enough to depict Mr. Larson standing in the hallway of their apartment building, pointing at a clipboard. Beside him was a tenant, who appeared visibly distressed, signing a paper under duress. "This is just a picture," Mr. Larson's lawyer said dismissively. "It doesn't prove anything." "It proves that Mr. Larson was pressuring tenants," Olivia retorted, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "I saw it happen. He made them sign papers so he could evict them without a real reason." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson studied the photo, his expression unreadable. Where and when was this taken? Right outside our apartment, Olivia said. I was playing with my camera. I didn't understand what was happening until later, but I knew it was wrong. Judge Thompson leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. He turned to Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, do you deny being present during this interaction? Mr. Larson shifted uncomfortably. Of course not, Your Honor. I interact with my tenants all the time. This photo proves nothing more than that. And the paper the tenant is signing? The judge pressed. Mr. Larson's lawyer quickly intervened. Your Honor, my client cannot be expected to recall every document signed by his tenants. This photo lacks context. Angela stood up, her voice firmer now. The context, Your Honor, is that this landlord has been targeting tenants he thinks can't fight back. He's forged notices, shut off utilities, and bullied families into leaving so he can raise the rent for new tenants. The judge's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the photo again. Mr. Larson, does your building maintain a record of tenant agreements and notices? Of course, Your Honor, Larson replied, though his voice was less confident now. Then I will request those records, Judge Thompson said, and I will personally review them against the claims made here. Mr. Larson's face turned pale and his lawyer's composure faltered. Your Honor, surely this is unnecessary. These claims are baseless. Baseless? Olivia interjected, her voice cutting through the room. If it's so baseless, why are you afraid of showing the records? Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Olivia's words hung in the air. Even Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow at her boldness. Hung, lady, the judge said, his tone softer now. You have a sharp tongue. But you also seem to have a point. He turned to Angela. Mr. Jenkins, I am reopening this case for further review. I will issue a subpoena for Mr. Larson's records and examine them thoroughly. Angela let out a shaky breath of relief, tears welling in her eyes. Olivia reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically, the balance of power no longer favoring Mr. Larson. Judge Thompson glanced at Olivia one last time, his expression a mix of sternness and admiration. This is highly irregular, but justice often demands flexibility. I'll see you all back here next week. As the gavel struck the desk, the courtroom erupted into chatter. Angela hugged Olivia tightly, whispering, "You are so brave." But Olivia, ever resolute, simply said, "We're not done yet, Mom. He's still lying. We have to make sure the truth wins." Judge Thompson watched them leave, his thoughts swirling. For the first time in years, he wondered if his adherence to procedure had blinded him to the very justice he was sworn to uphold. The courtroom doors had barely shut behind Angela and Olivia when the real storm began to brew. The reopening of the case set a chain of events into motion that no one could have anticipated. Judge Thompson, though skeptical, was compelled by Olivia's courage and the implications of her evidence. He knew this case was no longer just about one family, but a potentially widespread abuse of power. For Olivia, however, this wasn't about legal procedures or systemic injustice. It was about protecting her mom and finding a way back to the life they once knew. The next few days would test her resolve, Angela's patience, and Judge Thompson's principles. Judge Thompson, sitting in his chambers, frowned at the subpoenaed documents from Mr. Larson's building management. The stack of papers seemed endless. Rental agreements, payment logs, and eviction notices. Yet something was off. Many of the documents lacked proper timestamps, and signatures appeared suspiciously similar. He leaned back, staring at the photo Olivia had provided, which now sat framed on his desk as a reminder. Maybe there's more to this kid than I thought, he muttered to himself. The judge called in his court clerk, a young woman named Elena, to assist in sorting through the files. Elena, these documents don't add up. Start cross-referencing tenant complaints with these eviction notices. Something tells me Mr. Larson has been operating in the shadows for a long time. At the temporary shelter where Angela and Olivia were staying, Olivia sat at a worn table, flipping through a collection of her photos. Her old digital camera, scratched and battered, sat beside her. Angela approached, holding 2 cups of instant hot cocoa. "Sweetheart, it's late. You've been at this for hours," Angela said softly. Olivia shook her head. Mom, there has to be more. I remember hearing Mr. Larson yelling at Mr. Perez 2 doors down. He said something about a blank lease. Maybe I caught it on camera. Angela hesitated before sitting beside her daughter. Olivia, you're amazing, but this isn't your responsibility. Let the judge handle it now. But what if they miss something? Olivia insisted, her small hands gripping the edges of the photos. We can't trust them to care as much as we do. Angela's heart ached at her daughter's words. She reached out and gently turned Olivia's chin toward her. I care about one thing more than anything else in the world. You. And I don't want you losing sleep over people like Mr. Larson. Olivia looked down, her resolve faltering. But what if I can help? Angela smiled, brushing a stray curl from Olivia's face. You've already done so much, Liv. You're my hero. Meanwhile, Mr. Larson was far from idle. In his dimly lit office, he paced angrily, barking into his phone. I don't care what it costs. Make this go away. I don't need some soft-hearted judge digging into my business. His lawyer, sitting calmly across from him, sipped his coffee. We don't have much to hide if your records are clean. Larson shot him a glare. You know as well as I do they're not clean. The lawyer shrugged, leaning back. Then we have a problem. Larson slammed his hand on the desk. No, we have a solution. Find dirt on the mother, anything that can discredit her in court. And that kid? She's a problem too. Find out what school she goes to, where she's been staying. Pressure them. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. You're treading on dangerous ground. Dangerous? Larson scoffed. You don't get rich playing it safe. A week later, the courtroom was packed. Word of the case had spread, and several reporters sat in the back, their pens poised to record every detail. Angela and Olivia sat side by side at the defense table, their public defender flipping through a series of papers nervously. When Judge Thompson entered, the room fell silent. His expression was grim, his usual air of indifference replaced with an edge of seriousness. We are here to continue the case of Jenkins v. Larson, he announced. Over the past week, this court has reviewed extensive documents submitted by the plaintiff. However, certain inconsistencies have come to light. Larson's lawyer rose immediately. Your Honor, any inconsistencies are minor errors. They don't undermine the legality of the evictions. Judge Thompson's gaze was icy. Minor errors? Several documents have identical signatures across multiple tenants. Others list eviction dates before payment deadlines. How do you explain that? The lawyer faltered. Clerical mistakes, Your Honor, surely not uncommon in high-volume property management. Before the judge could respond, Olivia stood up, once again drawing the room's attention. That's a lie, she said firmly. Angela tried to pull her back down, whispering, Olivia, stop. But Olivia was undeterred. They're not mistakes. Mr. Larson did this on purpose. He even told tenants they'd lose everything if they didn't sign. My mom wasn't the only one. It happened to Mr. Perez and Mrs. Chong. And that's enough, Larson's lawyer barked. This child is not a credible witness. Judge Thompson raised his hand, silencing the outburst. He turned to Olivia. Young lady, you're not sworn in, so I can't officially take your statement. But if you have more evidence, now is the time to present it. Olivia hesitated for a moment before pulling out another photo from her notebook. It showed Mr. Larson standing over a small group of tenants, clipboard in hand, pointing angrily at a line of signatures. This was the day he made everyone sign fake leases, Olivia said. They didn't even know what they were signing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Thompson studied the photo, his expression darkening. Mr. Larson, do you deny this is you? Larson's face turned beet red. Of course it's me, but this photo doesn't prove anything illegal. Angela stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. It proves that you've been exploiting people who didn't know their rights, and you're still trying to intimidate us now. Larson's lawyer attempted to regain control. Your Honor, this is a circus. These accusations are baseless, and this photo is hardly evidence. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel. Enough! I've seen and heard enough to warrant further investigation. Mr. Larson, you are hereby ordered to submit to a full audit of your property management practices. Larson's lawyer objected, but the judge waved him off. This is not up for debate. As the courtroom cleared, Larson stormed out, his lawyer trailing behind him. Angela and Olivia stayed behind, gathering their things in silence. Judge Thompson called out, "Ms. Jenkins, a moment." Angela approached cautiously, Olivia in tow. "You're a brave young lady," the judge said to Olivia, "but this fight isn't over yet. The system takes time." Olivia met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Then I'll keep fighting until it's over." Judge Thompson smiled faintly. "I believe you will." As Angela and Olivia left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Angela shielded Olivia, but her daughter spoke boldly. "We're not giving up. People like Mr. Larson shouldn't get away with hurting families." Somewhere behind them, Judge Thompson watched from the steps, deep in thought. He had always believed in the system's integrity, but today a little girl had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. Sometimes, justice needed a human face to make it real. The days following the courtroom showdown were a whirlwind. Olivia's brave stand and the subsequent ruling to audit Mr. Larson's properties had garnered significant media attention. News outlets and social media buzzed with the story of the young girl who challenged injustice and the judge who was beginning to see the cracks in his own assumptions. The courtroom was packed once again. This time, Angela and Olivia sat more composed but still visibly nervous. The air was heavy with anticipation as Judge Thompson took his seat. "Today," he began, his voice carrying a newfound gravitas, "we will review the findings of the court-ordered audit into Mr. Larson's property management practices." A man in a sharp suit representing the auditors stood and presented the report. "Your Honor, our investigation uncovered numerous violations. Among them are falsified eviction notices, coercion of tenants to sign blank leases, and unauthorized increases in rent without proper notice. These practices are not only unethical, but in many cases illegal." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Thompson banged his gavel to restore order. "Mr. Larson, do you have a response to these findings?" Mr. Larson's lawyer stood, visibly sweating. "Your Honor, my client denies any wrongdoing. He contends that any irregularities were the result of mismanagement, not malicious intent." Judge Thompson fixed Larson with a hard stare. "Mismanagement does not excuse the systemic exploitation of vulnerable families. These findings paint a picture of deliberate and calculated actions." He turned to Angela. "Ms. Jenkins, based on this evidence, I am ruling in your favor. You are entitled to damages for the unlawful eviction, and Mr. Larson will face further legal action from the state." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she clutched Olivia's hand. For the first time in months, a sense of relief washed over her. That evening, Judge Thompson sat in his chambers, staring at the framed photo Olivia had provided. His mind wandered back to his early years as a judge, when he had believed in the purity of the law. Over time, his rigid adherence to procedure had hardened him, making him blind to the human element of justice. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Elena, his clerk, entered with a stack of new files. "Long day, Judge?" He nodded. Longer than most. That little girl reminded me of something I lost sight of. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about people." Elena smiled. "She's quite something, isn't she?" "She is," Judge Thompson agreed, his voice softer now, "and she's made me realize I have some changes to make." Angela and Olivia's lives began to stabilize. The court ruling not only provided financial compensation, but also forced Mr. Larson to vacate several properties, which allowed displaced tenants to return home. One sunny afternoon, Angela and Olivia stood outside their old apartment building. The landlord's sign had been replaced with one from a new management company. Angela carried a box of belongings, while Olivia balanced her old camera on her shoulder. "Feels good to be back, doesn't it, Mom?" Olivia said with a grin. Angela smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It feels like home." Neighbors gathered around them, offering hugs and thanks. Many credited Olivia for her courage, and some even shared their own stories of how her actions inspired them to stand up for themselves. Months later, Olivia was invited to speak at a community event organized to raise awareness about housing rights. Standing on a small stage in a crowded park, she adjusted the microphone nervously before speaking. "My mom always taught me that the truth matters," she began, her voice steady, "and that if you see something wrong, you should try to fix it. I didn't think I'd ever be in a courtroom or have to stand up to someone as powerful as Mr. Larson, but I knew it wasn't right for him to hurt families like ours." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "Sometimes it feels like kids can't do much. But we can. We can ask questions, tell the truth, and make people listen. And when we do, amazing things can happen." The audience erupted into applause, and Angela, standing off to the side, beamed with pride. Judge Thompson, sitting in the back of the audience, listened intently to Olivia's speech. He had come in unannounced, dressed casually, blending in with the crowd. Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he realized how much he had learned from her bravery. Later that evening, he returned to his chambers and began drafting a proposal for reform in the local court system. It included mandatory bias training for judges and a new initiative to provide resources for tenants facing eviction. He knew it wasn't enough to correct all the wrongs, but it was a start. Before leaving for the night, he placed Olivia's photo back on his desk. It was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a reminder of the power of courage and the importance of listening to those who often go unheard. On a quiet evening, Angela and Olivia sat on their new couch in their cozy living room. The walls were lined with photos, including a framed copy of Olivia's now famous photo of Mr. Larson. Angela held a mug of tea, while Olivia flipped through the pages of a notebook filled with ideas for her next photography project. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you didn't show that photo?" Angela asked. Olivia looked up, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes. But I don't like to think about what-ifs. We did the right thing, and that's what matters." Angela leaned over and kissed Olivia's forehead. "You're my hero, you know that?" Olivia grinned. "I learned from the best." Outside their window, the city buzzed with life, and for the first time in a long while, their home felt like a safe haven, a place where truth had prevailed and justice had been served. Judge Thompson sat alone in his office late one night, reviewing a new case. As he read, he thought about the Jenkins case and the lessons it had taught him. "I've spent a lifetime making judgments," he mused aloud. "But it took an 8-year-old to show me what justice really means." With a renewed sense of purpose, he turned back to the case in front of him, ready to approach it with the fairness and empathy that Olivia had inspired in him.